Hello, my name is Patricia Rose de Leon, and today I will be doing the fourth Talk to the Text assignment for the class Introduction to Human Physiology. So I believe the chapter, the topic for this chapter will be about action potentials, and since the information here in the text here on the right is not clearly shown, then I won't be going over that. So I'll only be going over the pages 68, 69, and 70. So yeah, since I have a lot of information to go over, I'll just get started right away. Okay. So action potential recorded by the microelectrode is shown in figure 3.9a. Voltage change is shown on the vertical axis and time on the horizontal axis. In figure in figure 3.9b, the action potential is schem, oh my schematized as a bubble of activity traveling along the axon from the point of electrical stimulation past the place where the electrode is. The recording electrode sees what is happening. Okay. So the recording electrode sees what is happening at one place on the axon over time as the action potential passes over it. Comparing the two figures should help you to visualize more clearly what is displayed on the graph of the action potentials. So it doesn't show what the two figures are in this text, but based on this paragraph, from what I learned is that okay. So although the picture of the recording electrode is not really shown, as well as um the other visual representation of it as predicted here in the text, I'm guessing is that the recording electrode is an instrument that is used to um terminize that is used as like an electrical terminal that specializes in particular electrochemical reactions. Specializes for a particular electrochemical reaction. So, um, figure 3.9b and figure 3.9a is not exactly shown in this PDF, but I guess from this highlighted section right here, I could tell what the function of what an recording electrode is and what its purpose is. So yeah, it might be something. It might be like information that I might need to know for when I'm reading this text. So the first event is an abrupt and rapid increase in the voltage across the membrane from its resting level of negative 70 millivolts to a peak of positive 50 millivolts, and then a rapid drop in voltage. Okay, voltage. The drop con- the drop continues. The drop continues below the resting level and more gradually recovers to the resting level. The initial part of the action potential, the rapid rise and fall of membrane voltage, is often called the action potential proper, or the spike. The lower phase, which the voltage falls below the resting potential and then recovers, is called the after potential. Okay. So we know that the first event or the first phase of an action potential is um, depolarization. depolarization, and it's basically where there's a in the rapid rise in the action potential because of the opening of sodium channels. Opening of sodium channels. And moreover, from how I interpreted it, is basically the action potential proper or the spike. So basically, it's kind of like the main wave in the action potential of a nerve after it is followed by a negative and positive after potential. So it is the main wave in the action potential. Meanwhile, after potentials are um so basically it's like the part of an action potential that remains after the electrical potential has like reached its peak or spike. Part of the action potential that remains after the peak or after the spike. Okay, so moving on, the voltage level, the action potential reaches at its peak. The voltage level, the action potential reaches at its peak positive 50, positive 50 millivolts. Right, might ring a bell. It is the voltage difference between the inside and the outside of the membrane that will exist if the membrane were freely permeable to sodium ions. This value was calculated from the Nernst equation in a discussion of the resting potential. So this was something that was mentioned in the first reading assignment in a discussion of the resting potential. When the value for the high concentration of sodium outside the membrane and the value for the low concentration inside are substituted into the Nernst equation, the equation predicts the membrane potential of positive 50 millivolts of the membrane and were freely permeable to sodium ions. So basically, this paragraph just shows information that is already talked about in the first reading assignment. So I don't think I needed to include any new annotations for this part. And I just need to look over the first annotated PDF of the first reading assignment. So yeah, I just basically highlighted all of the key terms as well as the key definition for the Nernst equation, what is its purpose, and yeah, I don't think there's anything else needed to be added for that part. So instead, I think I will just put a um a short note here below to look over the no look over the RA1 annotated PDF annotated PDF for more info on this part right here. We saw earlier that the membrane at rest is only slightly permeable to sodium ions, about 1/28 as permeable to potassium. There are many sodium channels in the membrane, but they are mostly gated and most of the gates are closed. When an action potential develops at a place on the membrane, all the sodium gates there suddenly pop open and the membrane becomes freely permeable to figure 3 point to freely permeable to sodium ions, which is shown in figure 3.10. So this is what um we call, or at least this phase is what we call depolarization. Basically, which is where, um, as mentioned before, all of the sodium channels open. Because the concentration of sodium outside the membrane is very much higher than the inside, because the concentration is very much higher than the inside, there's a strong diffusion force pushing the sodium in. The resting membrane potential is negative inside relative to the outside. Negative inside, negative 70 millivolts relative to the outside, owing chiefly to the presence of negatively charged protein molecules. Since sodium is positively charged, these ions are attracted inside by the excess. So, sodium ions are attracted by are are attracted inside by the excess negative charge of the proteins. When the sodium channel gates open, both the diffusion force and the electrical force are working in the same direction to move sodium ions in. This results in a 500-fold increase in the membrane permeability to sodium. The rush of sodium ions into the cell at the site of the action potential is massive, so dominating other ion movements that the membrane potential goes all the way to the Na equilibrium potential of positive 50 millivolts, predicted by the Nernst equation. Because sodium is positively charged at the place where these ions move into the cell membrane, acquires a positive charge inside. Okay, so basically what this whole paragraph is trying to say is that because there's many sodium ions on the outside of the axon and inside of the neuron is negative relative to the outside, these sodium ions basically rush in to the neuron. And yeah, it's mentioned that the sodium has a positive charge, so the neuron becomes more positive and becomes depolarized. So, summary, because there are many more ions on the outside and the inside of, of the neuron is negative to the outside. The the sodium ions basically um rush in to the neuron. You also have to remember that sodium ions have a positive charge, so the neuron becomes more positive and depolarized. So we're done for this for the 68 chapter 3 section. So we'll move on to page 69, which is about membranes and potentials. So here we have figure 3.10. When the action potential develops and the membrane potential shifts rapidly from negative 70 millivolts to positive millivolts, the closed sodium channels pop open briefly and then close again. So So this happens when the action potential develops and the membrane potential shifts rapidly from negative to positive. Meanwhile, the many fewer closed potassium channels pop open and then close more slowly, producing the after potential. So when the closed potassium channels pop open, I believe that is what we call the repolarization. Repolarization. As we can see here, so okay, so depolarization. Let me just. So depolarization happens at number three. Depolarization, and at number four or in number five, there when there is a sudden drop at the graph, this is where um repolarization happens. Repolarization happens. And in six, um, well, if it drops significantly low and then goes back up again, that is hyperpolarization. And number seven is basically the resting state. So negative 55. So when it is at negative 55, that is what we call the threshold, or I'll just put letter T there. And this is the stimulus. No, just put letter S right here. So when, as mentioned before, in depolarization state, the Na or the sodium ions, they come in, and during the repolarization state, um, the K ions come out. So this is what happens um, in the membrane. Okay. So we have two visual rep- so we have two visual representations of what actually happens in the membrane, in the cell membrane, as depicted here in the graph. So as we can see here in number one, the the gates, the channels, I mean, and the gates are closed, but then it becomes open when it reaches depolarization. The sodium ions come out, it closes once again, and it remains that way until the seventh figure. But once we reach the repolarization state, the gates are closed, but it opens on the second um, state, and then lets the um, lets the potassium ions out. So yeah, and so once it reaches the sixth state, which is basically the hyperpolarization, the gate closes once again, and then it reaches the resting state. Okay, so moving on, at about the time the membrane potential reaches the sodium equilibrium value of positive millivolts, the Na channel or the sodium channel gates close up again. This membrane is no longer permeable to sodium, and its potential rapidly goes back to the resting level of -70 millivolts. Why this happens will be explained shortly. One other event also occurs as the sodium channel gates open and close. The few potassium channels that are normally closed open up, letting sodium cross the membrane even more freely than it can when the membrane is at rest. You may remember that the resting membrane potential level predicted by the Nernst equation from the concentration of potassium inside high and outside low is negative 75 millivolts, a bit more negative than the actual measured of negative 70 millivolts. This is due in part to the smaller influences of other ions, the chloride and the sodium ions, but also because the membrane is not completely permeable to potassium. Some of the potassium channels have closed gates in the resting state. Okay, so basically in this paragraph, it talks about what happens when the potassium channels open. So, so when the potassium channels open, what happens is that it allows potassium ions to rush out of the cell down at its electrochemical gradient. And so when this happens, okay, so when this happens, this event it rapidly decreases the membrane potential and then it brings it back to the normal resting state. Rapidly decreases the membrane potential, bringing it back to its normal resting state. However, it says here that according to the Nernst equation, the resting membrane potential will be negative 75 millivolts, which is a bit more negative than the actual measured level of negative 70 millivolts. And the reason why it's negative 75 millivolts is because we have to take into the account the influences of other ions, such as chloride and sodium, and because potassium is not completely permeable, which means that um, potassium channels have closed gates in the resting state. So the opening of the normally closed sodium channels allows sodium ions to flow freely across the membrane. Okay. So the opening of the normally closed sodium channels allows sodium ions to flow freely across the membrane, and the membrane goes to the potassium equilibrium potential of negative 75 millivolts as some potassium ions move out of the cell. The sodium gates open and close the potassium gates open and close more slowly than the sodium gates. Although both sets um, Although both sets of gates open at about the same time during an action potential, the effect of these sodium gates dominates because the previous concentration of sodium on the two sides of the membrane is much more out of balance. The force move, moving sodium ions is very much greater than the small force moving potassium ions are. The sodium gates are quickly closed, but the potassium channel gates The sodium gates are quickly closed, but the potassium gates remain open for a while, and the membrane potentials go towards negative 75 millivolts. After the potassium gates close, the membrane potential returns to its normal resting level of negative 70 millivolts. The slower potassium movement out of the cell generates the after potential. Remember that potassium channels with gates that open and close are much less common than permanently open permanently open uh, potassium channels, which determines the resting level of the membrane potential. Okay, first part of this paragraph, basically what it's trying to say is that um, since K plus or potassium ions is high in concentration, this means the K plus or the potassium ions diffuse outward uh, through the channel. And so since there is a bit of delay in the potassium channels compared to the sodium channels, um, so because of a delay in the opening of K plus channels, they they open at about the same time that the sodium channels are closing because of inactivation. So they open the same time that the Na or the sodium channels close. And so basically, the last half of this paragraph just describes what happens after the potassium channel is open and when it returns to the resting level of the membrane potential. So, yeah, pretty self explanatory. So, to summarize, when an action potential develops at place on the axon membrane, the sodium channel gates open very briefly, about zero point 0.5 milliseconds. Sodium rushes in and the membrane potential becomes positive inside relative to outside, positive 50 millivolts. Then the sodium gates close and the potential goes back to the rest and goes back toward the resting level. Meanwhile, the sodium gates have opened. Meanwhile the potassium gates have opened. So some potassium moves out and the membrane potential becomes even more negative, negative 75 millivolts, then at rest for a few milliseconds. This is the after potential. The few potassium channels with gates now closed and the membrane returns to its resting potential level of negative 70 millivolts. The period when the sodium gates are open, when the spike of the actual potential develops and decays, is often termed as the absolute refractory period in older texts. During this period, the axon cannot be electrically stimulated to generate another action potential. During the period of the after potential, the axon can be electrically activated, but it requires a stronger than normal electrochemical stimulus that is the relative refractory period. So yeah, this the first half of this paragraph is basically just a summary of what we went over in the earlier text, but as we kept on reading, we learned a bit of new information such as the absolute refractory period and the relative refractory period. So what is the difference between them? So the absolute refractory period is basically the period in which the sodium ion channels are like completely inactive, but compared to the relative refractory period, um, where the inactive sodium channels transit to the active forms except the second signal. So basically in here, sodium channels are inactive, but in here, kind of like the inactive thingy transit to the active form to accept second signal. Okay, so moving on, some of the strongest experimental evidence for the mechanisms I have just described comes from the use of specific blocking agents. A drug called the tetrodotoxin or TTX completely blocks the sodium channels. When applied to the axon, it blocks the inward movement current of sodium and the membrane does not become depolarized. TTX incidentally comes from the puffer fish in Japan. If the fish is properly prepared, it is considered a delicacy and is popular in Japan. However, if the chef goofs, the customer may ingest TTX and die. Okay, so that pretty much ends um the um talk to the text assignment um for the fourth reading aloud assignment. So yeah. This video is pretty short compared to the others, so I will be submitting this through Canvas in complete form. So yeah, I will also submit the annotated um PDF for this text if possible through Canvas. So yeah, thank you so much for listening and have a nice day.